You thought being good would protect you. You thought if you were available enough, understanding enough, patient enough, that people would eventually match what you were giving. You thought kindness created safety. You thought loyalty was something that accumulated over time like interest, quietly building in the background while you kept showing up. The painful truth is that it often created something else entirely, and somewhere in your history, in a specific moment with a specific person, you felt what that something else actually was. You felt it. You explained it away. You kept giving. The story of how a man goes from nice to smart is not a story about becoming hard. It is a story about a particular kind of education that only arrives through direct contact with what people actually do when they are certain you will not leave. Most men never fully examine this story. They live inside it their entire lives, cycling through the same patterns with different people, wondering why the outcome keeps resembling the previous one. The man who examines it closely enough discovers something that Machiavelli spent his entire career documenting. That human behavior follows consistent patterns beneath the surface of whatever people present when they believe they are being observed. And the man who learns to observe those patterns rather than simply respond to them has stepped into a different relationship with power than the one he was born into. But the beginning of that journey is never comfortable. It starts with belief, full, uncomplicated belief that people are fundamentally what they present themselves to be, that the friend who calls himself loyal is loyal, that the person who says they care will demonstrate that care when the moment requires it, that the relationship where you have invested the most will be the one that holds the firmest when pressure arrives. You operated from this belief for longer than you probably want to admit. You noticed small contradictions and classified them as exceptions. You felt moments of doubt and suppressed them because the alternative, accepting that the belief was wrong, was a revision you were not ready to make. You kept giving, and the giving felt like virtue. It felt like the right way to be a person in the world. It felt like something that would eventually be recognized and matched. The painful part was not being used. The painful part was realizing how long it had been happening before you allowed yourself to see it clearly. Machiavelli understood something about this that most people resist accepting. He observed that men are not taken advantage of because they are stupid. They are taken advantage of because they are operating from a model of human behavior that is more flattering to human nature than human nature actually deserves. They assume reciprocity because reciprocity is what they are offering. They assume integrity because integrity is what they are practicing. They project their own interior onto the people around them and then feel genuinely confused when the behavior that returns does not match the projection. This is not naivety in the simple sense. It is a failure to understand that the way you operate is not a universal description of how people operate. It is a personal standard. And personal standards, when left unexamined and extended automatically to everyone, become a liability in a world that does not share them uniformly. Think about the specific version of yourself that appeared in relationships where you gave too much. The version that texted first, consistently, that rearranged schedules to be available, that absorbed moods that were not caused by you and treated them as problems requiring your attention, that stayed in conversations long past the point where something felt wrong because leaving felt like betrayal and staying felt like loyalty. You noticed something was off. You ignored it. You explained it away with language that sounded like generosity but functioned like self-deception. They are going through something. They will show up differently when things settle. This is just a difficult period, and some of that was true some of the time. but some of it was the story a man tells himself when he needs the relationship to be what he decided it was more than he needs it to be, what it actually is. The strange thing was not what people took from you. The strange thing was what you kept offering them in exchange for evidence that they were not worth offering it to. This is the pattern that most men eventually have to sit with, that the exploitation they experienced was not entirely done to them. Part of it was permitted by them, not consciously. Not through weakness in the simple sense, through the absence of limits that would have communicated to the other person where availability ended and self-respect began. Machiavelli wrote that men will always take from you what they can unless they are given a reason not to, not because they are uniformly malicious. Because the absence of a boundary reads as permission, and permission, once established, is rarely voluntarily surrendered by the person who benefits from it. The nice man never creates the reason. He keeps absorbing. He keeps accommodating. He keeps making it easy to take from him without consequence, and he calls it kindness while it is happening, and something much more complicated when it stops. Watch what happens in workplaces where one person is visibly more agreeable than everyone else, more willing to accept additional responsibility, more reluctant to push back on unreasonable requests, more available at inconvenient times, more focused on being perceived as cooperative than on managing the terms under which cooperation is offered. That person is not promoted for their agreeableness. They are loaded with the work that nobody else will accept. They are given appreciation that is entirely verbal and entirely unpaid. They are told they are valued in precisely the moments when what is actually happening is that their inability to create limits is being maximally utilized. And when they eventually do push back, when the resentment of years of accommodation finally surfaces and they ask for something in return for what they have been providing without complaint, the reaction from the people around them is often one of genuine surprise, as if the boundary itself is the problem, as if the years of unlimited availability had established an entitlement in others that the man himself never intended to create. This is not a story about bad people. It is a story about what happens when one person's generosity exists without structure inside an environment populated by people who are primarily focused on their own requirements. Machiavelli called this the fundamental error of the man who believes goodwill is its own protection. Goodwill is not protection. Goodwill without the ability to withdraw it is simply unconditional supply. And unconditional supply changes behavior in the people receiving it, whether they consciously recognize it or not. You thought the lesson was to stop caring. That was not the lesson. The lesson was something much darker and more precise. The lesson was that access without limits is not generosity. It is an invitation written in permanent ink that you never meant to sign. Now think about the transition. The moment the nice man begins to see the pattern clearly enough to change his relationship with it, it does not arrive cleanly. It arrives as a specific exhaustion, not the tiredness that sleep fixes. The tiredness that comes from finally admitting to yourself that a story you have been telling yourself for years is not accurate and has not been accurate for longer than you want to count. The transition begins not with anger, but with observation. He starts watching differently. Where he once saw what people said, he now tracks what people do when the saying and the doing do not align. Where he once extended trust as a default, he now allows behavior to accumulate before trust is adjusted to match it. Where he once filled silences and gaps and uncomfortable spaces with his own effort, he now allows the silence to reveal who else is willing to move. And what he discovers in that silence is frequently educational. He discovers that some of the connections he was maintaining almost entirely through his own forward motion stop moving the moment he stops pushing. He discovers that some of the loyalty he believed was mutual was actually a function of his own refusal to test whether it existed independently of his effort. He discovers that some people in his life had organized themselves comfortably around his unlimited availability without ever examining whether they were offering anything remotely equivalent. These discoveries do not arrive with drama. They arrive quietly, with a clarity that is almost cold in how specifically it identifies what was actually happening beneath the surface of what he had chosen to believe. Machiavelli observed that the moment a man stops being easy, the room around him recalibrates. People who relied on his endless accommodation begin behaving differently. Some become more reciprocal because the scarcity of his attention suddenly makes it valuable in a way that its abundance never allowed it to be. Some reveal that what he interpreted as connection was actually convenience, and without the convenience there is nothing underneath. Both revelations are useful. The ones who become more reciprocal show him what a genuine dynamic can look like. The ones who disappear show him what was never really there. Neither outcome is a loss. Both outcomes are information. This is the transformation that nobody warns you about when they tell you to set boundaries. Setting limits does not just change how others treat you. It changes what you are able to see about how they were already treating you. The nice man cannot see this clearly because he is too close to his own giving. The smart man can see it because he has created enough distance between himself and his own generosity to watch what the room does when it is no longer guaranteed. Smart men do not become cold because they hate people. They become careful because they understand people, because they have watched enough patterns play out to know that most people are neither purely good nor deliberately predatory, but something more complex and more consistent than either. People protect their own interests. They do this naturally, automatically, without malice in most cases. And the man who builds his behavior around the assumption that they will routinely sacrifice those interests for his benefit will be systematically disappointed by the gap between the assumption and the reality. The smart man builds his behavior around what people actually demonstrate rather than what he wishes they would demonstrate. He is not colder. He is more calibrated. He cares less about being perceived as easy to be around and more about being surrounded by people whose behavior has earned the access they have been given. The problem was never kindness. Kindness in a man who knows his own worth is one of the most powerful things that can exist in a human dynamic. The problem was giving people access to you as if access were valueless, as if your time, your emotional presence, your attention, your patience, your willingness to absorb and accommodate and remain were things that existed in unlimited supply and required no reciprocity to continue. They are not limitless. They never were. And the man who begins treating them as the finite and valuable things they actually are will discover that the people worth keeping in his life will respond to that truth with respect. And the ones who only valued him for the version that never said no will show him, finally and clearly, exactly what they always were. That knowledge is not comfortable, but it is the only kind that lasts.